So the topic for tonight is the foundations of modern science, the empirical method. This is what it's often referred to simply as the scientific revolution that brought it into being. So this is sort of a narrative story, but there's I think for me personally, some really interesting aspects of this. There'll be a cast of characters that you will know, like Leonardo da Vinci, Copernicus, and some others. So big picture, always start with this. We're exploring the story of how we arrived at where we are today in the relationship between science and faith. And we're taking sort of a historical kind of sketch kind of over time. And of course, there's two parts of the story. There's the faith side and there's the science side. So sometimes we're one track, sometimes in the other. This week and next week, we're definitely hard on the science track. This is kind of where we left off last week. Throughout most of our history, our faith has openly embraced the accepted science of the day, of the time. Did not see conflict historically between science and faith, but rather, using the language of St. Augustine that we looked at last week, the language was that science and nature were two books written by the same creator. That God gave us the Bible and God also gave us nature. And his premise was that since God was the author of both, God would not contradict God's self, and therefore you could trust that the two supported each other. They were complementary, not contradictory. Historically, we also embraced a doctrine that we see before Augustine, but Augustine articulated it, and then we looked at John Calvin last week. It's called the Doctrine of Accommodation. The idea is actually in the Bible itself, that revelation is always adapted to the science and the worldview of the day. In the Bible, you've got Jesus saying, "You've heard it said, but I say to you." There's an Old Testament and there's a New Testament. Over time, the revelation will adapt. Otherwise, people simply could not embrace it. Now, this was to the point that the science and the worldview of the day, beginning with antiquity with Augustine, but then moving forward into the Middle Ages, the science of the day was embraced. And it literally became a part of the doctrine of the faith. It wasn't that the science was necessarily Christian or not Christian. It's just the faith embraced the culture, and part of the culture was the prevailing science at the time. Now, this included some things. One was the Ptolemaic worldview based on Aristotle's philosophy. This is sort of in the highlight of the Roman Empire in the 1st century AD, when Ptolemy over in Egypt basically built on Aristotle's philosophy, and he actually kind of mapped out the planets, how things in the heavens move. The two goals of science, one is to explain, and the other is to predict. Ptolemy's model was mathematical, and it did both. It actually explained the orbits, and it actually then predicted it. Now, he had to fudge a little bit, because some of the planets, as you watch them, they do what's called, they go in retrograde, which means in the sky they're moving one way, and then they'll back up, go the other direction, and then reverse again. Now, that's an optical illusion for us. They're actually going in ellipses, but from our perspective, they seem to do that. So Ptolemy had to add a few little things in there to make that work, but when he did that, it did work. Ptolemy's view, based on Aristotle's philosophy, was common sense, which is to say it was empirical. For example, the sun rotated around the earth. Well, we know that that's not true today, but in the ancient world, what did you see when you looked in the sky? As well as Aristotle's idea that the heavens could not change. And, other things like objects, we have, with Newton's 3 laws of motions, the first law is, says that an object will stay in motion until something else acts on it. That's the law of inertia. Well, Aristotle was the opposite, but it was common sense. In our world, something only moves if it's pushed. You stop pushing it, it ceases moving. So that's how he understood it. So all of this philosophical understanding, which, by the way, was very sophisticated and very complete, became adopted. In late antiquity, the worldview of Aristotle and Ptolemy and the way the cosmos was understood was embraced by the church as the official science of the faith. Again, not that it's particularly Christian or non-Christian, it's simply we embraced what was the prevailing science, the accepted science of the day. Now, we're going to deal several times tonight with myths. Contrary to the popular myth, the church was not anti-science, and the church did not have its own alternative facts view of science. It simply embraced the accepted science of the time that scientists themselves put forward. Now, this union of the faith with the ancient, with the science of the ancient world, the science of the Greco-Roman world, Ptolemaic science, Aristotelian philosophy, lasted for well over 1,000 years. As a matter of fact, the philosophy of Aristotle actually lasts 2,000 years. But in the Ptolemaic version, a good 1,000 years, which, by the way, is not a bad run. But during the 1500s, things began to unravel and to change from the science side, which is to say, science itself started to change how it understood the natural order. And the faith would find itself playing catch-up and trying to come to terms with the changes of how science understood the world. Science had been wed, or the faith had been wed, the church had been wed to the science of antiquity for 1,000 years. Well, when science starts to change, there's going to be a reticence to let go of what was. And that reticence is not just from the religious people, it's also from other scientists. Anybody that studies science knows that. So today what we want to do is sort of walk through that story of the change in science. We'll talk just a little bit about the faith. Mostly we'll do that in other deals. But essentially, this is the story of how science itself fundamentally changed how it viewed the world. It's the story of the emergence of a new way of understanding the world, the cosmos, nature. It's a way that, first of all, was called the New Philosophy, because you may remember in the ancient world, the word science is actually a very modern term that was only coined in the 1800s, science and scientist. Originally, what we call science was called natural philosophy or philosophy of nature. So back when this starts to change, the language that people are using is, well, there's a new philosophy. We would say there's a new science, but there's a new way of understanding the world. We know it as modern science. Today, we refer to the transition from the old to the new as the scientific revolution. Now, that was not the language of the time. That's actually language from centuries later. But from our viewpoint, we look back and we can see that it is a genuine, authentic revolution in human understanding. Now, the common understanding, and it's out there in spades, and you've probably encountered it, is that the scientific revolution began with Copernicus and his heliocentric view, or his sun-centered view of the universe. Now, at this point in time, we didn't know there was anything beyond our solar system. So our solar system, you know, the 7 planets, the sun, the moon, the star, we thought that was the total universe, but there was no sense of anything beyond our solar system, much less galaxies. So it was a very kind of limited view. He had been working on that for a long time. His work was published after he died in 1543. So he was really not in play with this, but his ideas came forward. Tradition says that then the scientific revolution ended about a century later with Isaac Newton and the publication of the Principia Mathematica, 1687. So begins with Copernicus, ends with Isaac Newton. After Newton, modern science exists. Now, it's generally acknowledged that the modern scientific revolution, which took place in a little over 100 years, and depending on who you start and end with, some people would say it all happened in the 1600s and in less than a century, but you know, give or take a century, that revolution is the most profound ideological shift in human history. Period. Nothing else comes close. It's one that resulted in the modern world that we have today. We talked about earlier Luther and his impact. Well, Luther is right in this time frame. Luther's first, then the scientific revolution, then the Enlightenment. But in this period of time, things are shifting, and they're shifting fundamentally. But the dates and the players may be misleading. Here's a book for you, The Invention of Science by David Wooten. Now, David Wooten is one of the most respected historians of science. He spent his entire life studying this. He's got a fantastic book about Galileo, many books. Anyway, he has a little bit of a twist on this I want to kind of present to you, because I think he's got a compelling argument here. Neither of the two works cited, Copernicus' Revolutions, Newton's Principia, neither of those works were empirical. Now think about that for a second. They're both mathematical constructions. Now, if we're talking about empirical science, which is usually what we mean by the term science, we might want to shift the dates and the players slightly, not hugely, but I'm going to give you what David Wooten says here, and I think he's got a good argument. David Wooten sees empirical science as arising between two very specific dates, or I should say two very specific events that we can date exactly. The event that Wooten lifts up as the beginning of the scientific revolution happened in 1572, when there was an astronomer called Tycho Brahe who observed something. This is, by the way, this is before the telescope. So he's looking at the skies, naked eye. He observed something in the heavens, something that no one could remember ever having seen. Something that, according to the very best science of the day, should not be there. As a matter of fact, according to the science, could not be there. This could not be happening. But with your eyes, you can see it happening. What Tycho Brahe saw was a new star. We know it by the Latin name, a nova. The reason the discovery of the new star was so momentous was that the established science of the day, which was based on Aristotle and had been around since the 4th century BC, the science that had been accepted for nearly 2,000 years, said that there could be no change in the heavens. The heavens were perfect. There could be nothing new in the heavens. But he was looking up, and there was a star where there had not been a star. There's a new star, a nova. The presence of a new star violated this belief of Aristotle, and it raised profoundly disturbing questions. We might laugh at this today, but back then this was not a laughing matter. It really rattled people. It wasn't just that it called into question the belief that there couldn't be anything new in the heavens, although that was true. It also called into question the foundation of that belief, the basis of that belief. It called into question the accepted basis of human knowledge. That is, it called into question the accepted science of the day. At the time, human knowledge was grounded in ancient authorities, and the authority on all things celestial was, of course, Aristotle. And if Aristotle was wrong about the possibility of something new in the heavens, what else might Aristotle have been wrong of? It's as though today we suddenly decided, well, gravity doesn't exist. Well, what do you mean gravity doesn't exist? I mean, it's that earth-shaking. This raised an even deeper and more fundamental issue of whether the ancient authorities were a valid basis for our knowledge about the world as they had been for many, many centuries. For nearly 2 millennia, people of science had said that the way we determine if something is true in nature is we go back to the ancient authorities, and what did the ancient authorities say? It is this fundamental questioning of the very foundations of human knowledge that Wooten sees as launching the scientific revolution. Slightly different from Copernicus. Copernicus proposing a new model, but Copernicus's model was based on math, not on empirical observations. It's a conceptual model. With this, with Brahe, Tycho Brahe, we have something empirical. We see something that doesn't make sense. It requires explanation. And of course, you know, that's the very heart of science. Looking at something in nature doesn't make sense. And so he sees this as the starting point. And it began with an empirical observation of something new in the heavens. Now, at the other end, the date that Wooten lifts up as the conclusion of the scientific revolution is 1704. This is 17 years after Newton has published the Principia Mathematica. And again, a lot of people say it's with the Principia that the final nail is driven into the old worldview and the new world is fully here. But Wooten's going to disagree with that. It says, you know, 1704, 17 years after Principia, is the year that Newton published another work. It is, in fact, his major contribution not to math, but to empirical science, which is based on Newton's observations of light. The work was simply known as optics. In optics, Newton recorded the experiments he carried out. These are empirical, you know, experiments, and he's using lenses and prisms, which is kind of a new technology that's starting to emerge. Also, he writes about the conclusions that he drew from these observations. His experiments overturn the prevailing view, again, going back to Aristotle, that pure light existed without any color. Newton used prisms and the new scientific method of experimentation to refract light into the color spectrum. Newton's prisms demonstrated empirically Aristotle was wrong. The foundation of human knowledge was wrong. Optics and the scientific method it used, along with the work others were doing at this time, drove the final nail in the coffin of the traditional way the world had been understood. It was now clear that the old way of viewing the world was inadequate, and that the new way, the empirical way, the way we refer to as the modern scientific method, was superior, far superior. By the time Isaac Newton had finished his work, 130 years after Tycho Brahe, the ancient and time-honored view of the universe, which had existed going back to the 400s BCE, you know, for 2,000 years, as well as the time-honored view of the basis of human knowledge, ancient authorities, had been totally dismantled. In their place, we would have a completely new understanding of the universe. I don't know that we can even comprehend how earth-shaking this would have been for the people at the time. And we're going to have a totally new basis for human knowledge. Now, science and knowledge are connected. The word science is from the Latin scientia, which means knowledge. So there's a direct connection here. Modern science is both a way of knowing, in other words, a methodology, we refer to as the scientific method, and it's also a new form of knowledge, which we generally refer to as empirical data. So it's a method, and it's a basis of knowledge. You know, there's something that comes out of the method. Now, 300 years after the fact, John Dewey, famous educator in America, would look back on these events, and he is the one who would coin the term the scientific revolution. At the time, they didn't use that language, but looking back, you can see it was a revolution. He used it to describe just how profound the change had been. It would be impossible to overstate just how revolutionary the emergence of the empirical method was. And here's the point we want to pursue, or just how hard it was for people to accept, especially people of science. Now, here's another myth. The great book, Galileo Goes to Jail, Other Myths About Science and Religion. Here's one of many myths that's out there. The myth is that the new science, based on the empirical method and reason, burst into the world stage, and of course, that reactionary church strove to stamp it out and opposed it at every turn. So you got science versus faith. Science, reason, enlightenment, everything wonderful. Church, boo, hiss, bad, standing in the way of science. That's the myth. The truth is that the new approach was so revolutionary that the people who had the most difficulty accepting it were not church officials, it was other scientists. Scientists at that time called natural philosophers, who had been brought up and trained in the old science, the old worldview, as well as traditional Aristotelian science. The church had embraced the Aristotelian science for 1,000 years, and of course, the church would now find itself struggling to accept this new science. And by the way, Protestants and Catholics took two different approaches here. We'll look at that in a few minutes. After his death in 1543, this is just for some context, Copernicus's work on the revolutions was published. He argued that the earth went around the sun, heliocentrism, not the other way around, geocentrism. We know that. Here's what's interesting. No one believed him. For a century, no one believed him for a good reason. His theory contradicted the existing science of the day. And by the way, his theory did not really empirically provide better answers than the Ptolemaic view. It was a little simpler and it was a little cleaner. But specifically Aristotle. Aristotle said that the sun circled the earth. This is the old science. And Aristotle was the accepted authority on all things celestial. Heliocentrism was also, and this is something I don't think we're really told, it was contrary to common sense and the empirical evidence. Heliocentrism is contrary to empirical evidence. Anybody could see that the sun rose and the sun sets. We see that every day. And anybody can see that the stars circle around the earth. And we have absolutely no sense of motion, of the earth. So all of our senses, all of our empirical data says that, the earth is the center and everything goes around the earth. Any attempt to challenge traditional authorities or to propose an alternative basis of knowledge, of course, is going to meet resistance. Wooten notes that in 1583, 40 years after Copernicus's revolutions, 11 years after Tycho's discovery of a new star, there were only 3 competent astronomers in Europe who accepted Copernicus's claim. The rest were still wed to the old science. His ideas would not be accepted until the 1600s. Galileo, it's going to be nearly a century after his paper is written. It's in the 1600s that we get new technology. And the new technology proves to be crucial. We're going to have the telescope. And the telescope would allow for empirical observations. And these empirical observations are going to begin to unravel the old worldview. And they play a role. Even then, the new view was still controversial, still met resistance. And there's some great stories here. This is the story of Cesare Cremonini. and Galileo. You know the story even though you don't know the name. When Galileo announced that he had discovered mountains on the moon, now Aristotle said that the moon was a perfectly smooth orb, as were all celestial bodies. Galileo looks, he sees spots on the sun. That's not perfect. He sees mountains on the moon. That's not perfect. He sees moons around Jupiter. He sees that Saturn has ears. We now know it is a ring. But I mean, the discoveries are coming quickly. Cremonini famously refused to look through Galileo's telescope. That's the story that you probably know. But sometimes left out of the story is he's not the only one. There were a large number of people who refused to look through the telescope. Now, in the myth, it was the church refusing to accept modern science. Now, here's typical art. There's Cremonini, his cardinal robes, his cardinal cap, and so he's being depicted as a prince of the church. So what we have here is, of course, the church hierarchy refusing to accept modern science, pushing it back into modern science. Well, that's a myth. The truth of the matter is, Cremonini was not a cardinal. He wasn't even a priest. He was one of the leading scientists of the early 1600s. He was a well-known Aristotelian astronomer, and I happen to be a friend and sometime adversary of Galileo. The reason that he gave for not looking through the telescope was that Aristotle had proven through impeccable logic, which, by the way, that was the acceptable scientific method of the day. Aristotle, you argued logically, and Aristotle had done that. Aristotle had proven logically that the moon could only be a perfect sphere. Cremonini wrote in the letter, all this staring through those lenses just befuddles my brain. Enough. I don't want to hear any more of it. Now, Cremonini later went on to publish a book about the heavens without a single mention of any of Galileo's numerous discoveries through the telescope. He did not include any of Galileo's discoveries on the moon, the sun, the Jupiter, or Saturn, because, as he said, they were not relevant to the task of science as he understood science. The science of the day was limited to logically reconstructing what Aristotle and the other ancients had to say. Now, contrary to the myth again, it was other scientists who opposed Galileo's new findings. Galileo has a wonderful letter to Kepler, Johannes Kepler, in which he's sort of grinching about this. Here's what he said. This, of course, Kepler's laws of motion give us planetary mechanics. Things orbit not in circles but in ellipses. The speed is not constant; it varies. He has 3 laws of planetary motion. My dear Kepler, I wish that we might laugh at the remarkable stupidity of the common herd. What do you have to say about the principal philosophers of this academy? Not the church leaders, not the cardinals, not the Pope, the principal philosophers of this academy, our own body of scientists, who do not want to look at either the planets, the moon, or the telescope. Even though I have freely and deliberately offered them the opportunity 1,000 times. Truly, just as the asp stops its ears, so do these philosophers, scientists, shut their eyes to the light of truth. A lesser known example was when Galileo told the professor Giordano Bruno that based on his own observations of a human cadaver, which he experimented on, that the nerves of the body were connected to the brain, not to the heart. The accepted science of the day, going back to Aristotle, said that the nerves were connected to the heart. If you think about this, sometimes if you get scared or stuff like that, you can feel it in your chest. But again, this was an empirical, intuitive approach not cutting open the body, just, where do you feel it? Well, you tend to feel things in your chest, so they must be connected to your heart. The professor refused to accept Galileo's findings because they were, quote, unscientific. Bruno's comments give us an insight into the thinking of the time. This is what you have to say. This is his response to Galileo. They're both in front of the body, and Galileo's just shown empirically what's going on in the body. And so Bruno says, it does indeed seem as if the nerves originate in the brain. I can see that with my own eyes. And yet, Aristotle maintained that they originate in the heart. But if there is a contradiction here, and there does appear to be one, I would rather believe in Aristotle than in nature. Isn't that an insightful deal? In Galileo and Bruno, we see the collision of two views of science based on two views of human knowledge. Do we defer to ancient authorities, or are we going to use our senses and our reason? Cremonini and Bruno were far from unique. In 1668, the English new philosopher Joseph Granville found himself arguing with scientists like Bruno, who were entrenched in the older view. Scientists who dismissed all discoveries made by microscopes and telescopes. And you're going to love this, because these instruments, telescopes and microscopes, were deceitful and fallacious. They had violated the traditional and time-proven way of doing science that had existed for 2,000 years. The accepted science of the day, which held sway well into the 1600s, held that the truth in all categories was to be found in the past. The further you went back in time, the closer you got to the truth. The furthest back you could go was to the ancient Greeks, especially, again, Aristotle. He was known as the philosopher. The leaders of the Renaissance of the 14th and 15th centuries accepted this view. They accepted the old science, seeking to enhance life by recapturing what had been lost in the past, specifically the Greco-Roman world. If we can just bring back what we've lost. Renaissance, rebirth. The battle cry of the Renaissance was ad fontes, back to the ancient authorities. There's where the answers lie. The Protestant Reformation, happening just before the scientific revolution, also accepted this principle, seeking to enhance faith by recapturing what had been lost in antiquity. Specifically, Protestants wanted to go back to the ancient church, the apostolic church, and there we would find the truth of our faith. The idea that life could be enriched by turning to the present, and that through reason and observation we could discover something new, was itself a new and radical idea. 1605, Francis Bacon published a work with a highly provocative title on the proficiency and advancement of learning. In his work, Bacon claimed to have discovered how to make discoveries. What he discovered is what we today refer to as the empirical or the scientific method. His tools were empirical observation and human reason. You use your senses, you observe, you design experiments, you use your brain to think it through, problem solve. Bacon argued that it would be through discovery in the present, new things, using reason and the senses, that human knowledge could be advanced. And that this was the way that we could make progress towards a better world. And in the centuries after him, the idea of human progress is just all over, everywhere. In the ancient world, that was an alien concept. During the Enlightenment, advancement and progress. The Enlightenment's the century after the scientific revolution. Scientific revolution is 1600s. the Enlightenment is the 1700s. Advancement and progress become core values, and still today for many. They can continue to be core values in the modern world that we're part of, although there are some people, as we know in our society, who reject these values. Until the 1600s, science, theology, and science itself were all linked to the past, to Aristotle, to other ancient authorities like the Bible. But during the 1600s, the new philosophy, what we know as modern science, shifted away from these foundations, embracing reason and the empirical method as a new basis for human knowledge. Now, Protestants were quick to embrace this change, and in a few weeks we'll be telling this part of the story. Catholics rejected it. It's interesting because they held the faith still going back to ancient authorities. Catholics at the time actually, because so many of the scientists, the new scientists, the empirical scientists, because so many of them were Protestants, the Catholic faith understood the new science as a Protestant heresy, and that language is actually used. So the Catholic Church held to its faith based on ancient authorities, by the way, until Vatican II in the 1960s. So in the 1600s, the 1700s, and the 1800s, and the 1900s, up until the 1960s, the official position of the Catholic Church was to be very skeptical and rejecting of modern science. That has changed with Vatican II. The Catholic Church was linked to traditional science based on ancient or Aristotelian science. By the way, the theology of the Catholic Church, even today, is the theology of Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas' theology is based on the philosophy of Aristotle. So it was strongly linked there. Now, the British writer Richard Bentley commented on the impact of this new approach to science and belief. This is what he observed. Here we have a typical Renaissance man, or Enlightenment. When the people saw that diseases, he's just observing, which they had attributed to witchcraft, were cured by a course of medicine with the new science, they were also cured of their former error. They learned truth through experience, not by the false belief that it caused by a witch, the devil, or God. And here in the Enlightenment, we're beginning to see some distance between science and faith. The scientific revolution, which occurs during the 1600s or the 17th century, is the most radical shift in epistemology, the way that we know what we know, that we've ever gone through. It was a change in the basis of human knowledge, of how we know and what we can trust. This resulted in a new basis of human knowledge based on empirical data, or the new word that was coined is the word facts. This is not a word you see before the scientific revolution. This the words emerges as a new word. Facts were empirical. Knowledge could now be confirmed by an appeal to evidence, not an appeal to an ancient authority. Evidence that was reasonable and verifiable by the senses. And the scientific method will add other components to that. As a result, facts emerge as the new basis of knowledge. Empirical data or facts replaced ancient authorities as the basis of knowledge about the natural world. And facts will become the primary battleground over the next several centuries. When we get to the issue of fundamentalism and biblical inerrancy, we're going to see that battle is over facts. So we'll be coming back to this later. This revolution, and just brace yourself for this, this revolution in human knowledge will be so complete and so sweeping that there's not a single scientific principle taught in the universities of 1580 that continues to be taught today. Not one. The change is that sweeping. By the dawn of the 18th century, This new approach to human knowledge had been embraced by the leading intellectuals across Europe, but society as a whole had not embraced their new way of viewing the world. Intellectuals, people of science, people of, as they used to say, letters, did embrace it. Average person in the pew, no. Of course, neither had the church, with the exception that within the Protestant tradition, there is a welcoming of this. These leading intellectuals believed that society and the church were still locked in the darkness of ignorance and the past, and that this ignorance was what was causing much of the suffering in the world. They believed that both society and religion needed to be enlightened as they had been. Now, starting 2 weeks from tonight and then 3 weeks from tonight, we will take 2 weeks exploring this part of the story, how the faith reacts to the modern science, both negatively and positively. And that both needed to be brought, this is the view of the Enlightenment, both needed to be brought into the light of the new philosophy, rational thought, modern science. That reason and science should be the basis of society, not tradition or ancient authorities. And you can see here that there's going to be a little tension because, religion is traditionally based on scripture and tradition, so still backward looking. So again, we're beginning to see some distance here. Doing this project of the Enlightenment would require nothing less than a social revolution. This will be the project of the 1700s. A revolution that would require the removal of the traditional sources of knowledge and of authority, replacing them with a modern and rational basis for society. They then set about to do this, and their project would have a name that you know. This is the project we know today as the Enlightenment of the 1700s. Methodism is born during this period. The United States comes into existence during this period. It was a phenomenal period, and there's a lot going on. It is with the Enlightenment that for the first time, science is placed somewhat in conflict with religion. It's not clear cut. It's not a toggle switch. It's not going, but we begin to see cracks in the wedding between science and religion. So next week, we're going to look at the other foundation of modern science, which is mathematics. We're going to look at Newton, Faraday, Maxwell, Einstein, and others. But for